Number 9. Nazi warplanes. During the fall of 1943, the British and the Germans engaged in a fierce battle for control of the Dodecanese Islands, which had been under Italian control since 1912. The fighting lasted for several days and ended with a German victory over the island of Leros. In 2003, a Luftwaffe transport plane was salvaged from the waters near the island and taken to the Hellenic Air Force Museum in Athens for preservation and display. It was a Junkers Ju-52 model aircraft, which served on virtually all World War II warfronts that the Germans fought on. A German soldier's remains were found inside the plane, and they were identified and sent back to his family. Authorities also found ammunition, personal belongings, and guns, which have since gone on display at the HAF Museum. The Ju-52 is also on display after undergoing an extensive preservation, and still bears the bullet holes from anti-aircraft guns that shot it down nearly 80 years ago. Another German plane, a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, was also salvaged from the waters of Leros. The Stuka was a dive bomber and ground-attack aircraft that served its purpose well during the war's early stages, but it lost its air superiority before the end of the conflict and became the prime target among anti-aircraft operations and Allied fighter planes. Sources suggest that the Stuka recovered near Leros was likely shot down in October 1943 after taking off from Rhodos Island. After spending 70 years at the bottom of the sea, it was transported to the HAF Museum, where it was put on display beside other historic wrecked planes. Number 8. A plethora of ancient shipwrecks. For years, fishermen and divers reported finding pottery and other seemingly ancient artifacts off the coast of the Greek archipelago of Forni, located near Turkey in the Aegean Sea. It finally happened in 2015. Marine archaeologists explored the area and found a lot more than they expected. During the team's very first dive, they found a late Roman-era shipwreck sitting in shallow water and surrounded by seagrass. And the discoveries kept coming, and by the end of the 13-day expedition, they had located 22 ancient wrecks, including some that are more than 2,500 years old. None of the vessels were scientifically documented at the time. Because most of the vessels were made of wood and deteriorated over time, very few traces of the vessels themselves remain. Divers identified wrecks by looking for other signs, like piles of lost cargo. Project co-director Peter Campbell told CBS News that the team hoped to find 3 or 4 wrecks and were pleasantly shocked to find more. He said that the number of hidden wrecks that have yet to be discovered near Forni is anyone's guess. The expedition only covered just 5% of Forni's coastline, meaning there are likely many more waiting to be found. Forni had no major cities, but contained a prosperous society with a profitable marble mining industry. There are very few mentionings of it in ancient Roman texts, which is one reason why the team was so surprised to find that many of the wrecks they found dated to this period. The evidence shows that even as historical sources paid little attention to Forni, it was an active harbor city. Number 7. Lost Spanish Galleon. The Spanish galleon Santo Cristo de Burgos mysteriously vanished in 1693 while en route from the Philippines to Mexico with a cargo of silk, porcelain, and tons of beeswax. Legend passed down through generations of indigenous locals in what is now northern Oregon tells tales of a huge ship that wrecked near the mouth of the Columbia River around the same time. It is here that scientists recently discovered the remains of the Santo Cristo de Burgos wreck following a 15-year search along the Oregon shoreline. Pieces of wood, porcelain, and other materials had been washing up for years, and part of the ship's upper deck remained visible until the 1920s. But it evaded official identification for centuries, while stories of the so-called beeswax wreck and claims of lost treasure and gold circulated. In addition to hearing about the wreck through local legend, experts received a tip from a fisherman named Craig Andes, who found bits of wood in some sea caves and recognized it as ship timber. He notified local archaeologists, who believed that, at first, Andes had misidentified some driftwoods as remnants of a shipwreck. But testing revealed that it was indeed from an ancient hardwood tree known as Anacardiaceae, and that the timber was felled around the year 1650. Evidence further showed that the wreck was already there when a 25-foot wave struck the coast in 1700. At the time, there wasn't a lot of ship traffic in the area, so the information helped to narrow down the likelihood that the ship was the long-missing Santo Cristo de Burgos. Speaking with National Geographic, local tribal official Robert Kenta cited the findings as proof that his ancestors knew what they were talking about all along. So while news of the ship's identity might be new knowledge, the shipwreck itself is not a new discovery. If given the chance to go on an adventure like the Goonies, would you do it? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Aboriginal settlements. Australia's first settlers arrived around 65,000 years ago, and their descendants still live there today. At the time, sea levels were much lower than they are now. These levels dropped even more as the most recent ice age took effect, extending coastlines much further out. When the ice age peaked around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 427 feet lower than where they stand today. The people who first reached Australia traveled there by boat from Indonesia, when there was much less water between the two landmasses. These early inhabitants, known as Aborigines, built settlements in places that were eventually swallowed by the encroaching coastline, when global temperatures rose significantly between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago. Archaeologists found evidence of at least 2 of these villages in 2021 while working off the country's northwestern coast. It marked the first discovery of a sunken Aboriginal settlement. Both sites slowly became consumed by the ocean towards the end of the Ice Age and are estimated to be around 7,000 years old. One village, located off the Dampier coast, was found sitting just 8 feet underwater. It contained hundreds of stone tools. The other site sits 46 feet beneath the surface and yielded 1 stone cutting tool. Scientists are confident that there are more submerged Aboriginal sites waiting to be found, and that they may help the research community learn more about the movement of early people. Number 5. American Star Shipwreck. The SS American Star was built in 1940 as a luxury cruise ship, but like many ships at the time, it was instead used for transporting American troops to Europe during World War II. Throughout the conflict, the cleverly camouflaged vessel was used to evacuate around 483,000 troops. After the war, the American Star finally got a chance to operate as originally intended, making its maiden cruise ship voyage in 1946. It traveled from New York City to England, the reverse route that the ill-fated RMS Titanic was sailing when it struck an iceberg and sank in 1912. The vessel changed hands numerous times, underwent several renovations, and operated under various names over the years. But just like with any other ship, time eventually took its toll on the American Star, and it began falling into disrepair. It went 16 years without any maintenance, rendering its engines dead and useless. In 1993, a Thai company bought the ship for $2 million, with plans to turn it into an upscale floating hotel. While being transported to its new location in 1994, the American Star encountered a harsh storm off the Canary Islands, causing the tugboat that was towing it to lose control. It ran aground and broke into 2 a few days later off the island of Fuerteventura. The ship was declared a total loss and was left behind to further fall apart in the shallow colossal waters, while vandals stripped it of its valuables. The front half of the American Star sat partially submerged near the beach for 13 years, before slipping beneath the waves in 2007. Number 4. Atlet Yam. In 1984, marine archaeologist Uhed Galili discovered the ruins of a submerged ancient village off Israel's Carmel coast. Known as Atlet Yam, it sits roughly 33 feet underwater and is considered one of the world's most remarkably preserved prehistoric sunken villages. Dating back to sometime between 6,900 and 6,300 BC, Atlet Yam provides experts with a rare glimpse at pre-pottery Neolithic society. Excavations at the 10-acre site uncovered houses, burials, and an interesting semicircular arrangement of 7 monolithic stones that once surrounded a spring. Archaeologists also found the oldest known examples of purpose-built freshwater wells. Residents were exceptionally healthy compared to most other groups of people at the time, and had an average lifespan of 50 years. Back then, this constituted a very long life. The people who lived at Atlet Yam enjoyed a nutritious diet, which may have contributed to their longevity. But they weren't immune to health issues, including disease, which was pretty much inescapable in the absence of modern science. The earliest known case of a human suffering from tuberculosis was actually identified in remains found at Atlet Yam a discovery that rewound the clock on the disease's initial appearance roughly 3,000 years. Residents were also prone to catching malaria and often suffered from a painful ear condition caused by cold water diving. To this day, it's unclear why the villagers ultimately picked up and left. Scientists have considered several theories, including the possibility that a tsunami or volcanic eruption triggered the abandonment. Around 9,000 years ago, flooding became a chronic problem in the area, so it's possible that rising sea levels made life at the village difficult and forced the population elsewhere. Number 3. Swedish Atlantis. In 2014, a team of divers discovered an extraordinarily rare collection of Stone Age artifacts off the Swedish coast in the Baltic Sea. Nicknamed Sweden's Atlantis, it's believed to be one of the oldest Nordic settlements ever found. It was built, lived in, and then left behind by a nomadic tribe around 11,000 years ago. Archaeologists retrieved wood and flint tools, carvings, animal horns, ropes, and even the bones of an extinct cattle-like species, an ancestor of modern cattle known as an auroch. The objects owe their remarkable preservation to a black gel-like sediment called gianis, which forms from decaying peat. They became encased in the substance shortly after they were submerged, and the lack of oxygen protected them from decay and disturbances. Shortly after the discovery, the team said that they also hoped to eventually find burials, which would qualify the site as an actual settlement, rather than a temporary camp that a group stayed at briefly while passing through. They were quick to point out that the nickname Swedish Atlantis is in no way meant to convey that the settlement has any connection to the fabled civilization that the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about. Most mainstream experts don't believe that Atlantis ever really existed, and it's simply a play on the concept of a civilization that sank into the sea. Number 2. Gianis D. The Gianis D was built in Japan in 1969 as the Shoyu Maru. It sailed under its original name until 1975, when it was sold and renamed the Marcos. A Greek shipping company bought the vessel and gave it its current name, the Gianis D, in 1980. The ship was traveling full speed ahead from Croatia to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 1983 with a load of timber when it crashed into a treacherous reef in the Suez Canal. The reef, known as Sha'ab Abu Nuhas, sits at the edge of an extremely busy shipping lane. It's well known among experienced sailors and presents on most maps, but it's difficult to spot, especially in the harsh sunlight, and it often goes unnoticed until it's too late, which is exactly what happened with the Gianis D. Today, the ship sits in 3 pieces on the northern end of the reef. Certain parts of the wreck are diveable, including the engine room, mess hall, and bridge. Because the vessel is tilted, it can be very disorienting, and is therefore only open to very advanced divers. Number 1. Ever Prosperity. There were 2 cargo ships called the Ever Prosperity, and they both suffered an interestingly similar fate. Known as twin ships, they were based out of the same port in Monrovia, Liberia, and they both wrecked on the reef coast of New Caledonia, a collection of islands in the South Pacific that belonged to France. The first ship, known as the SS Ever Prosperity, ran aground along the west coast barrier reef in 1965. The second Ever Prosperity met the exact same fate just 5 years later, in 1970. It hit the sea bottom just 45 miles south of the first wreck, while traveling from Sydney to the New Caledonian capital of Noumea. To make matters even more bizarre, both ships were under the command of the same captain, a man from Korea, when they wrecked. At first glance, the rusting ships are nothing special to look at, but knowing the strange story behind them makes them all the more interesting.
Number 9. Raid at Mackan Island. The Japanese-built Kawanishi H-8K was a type of seaplane called a flying boat. Equipped with 4 engines, this large aircraft was built for long-distance patrols and bombing missions over the ocean. Described by aviation historian René Francillon as the most outstanding water-based combat aircraft of the Second World War, it was an extremely reliable and successful plane. But like any other aircraft, the H-8K wasn't immune to being shot down in combat. The aircraft in this photo was disabled by an American anti-tank rifle during a battle called the Raid on Mackan Island. which took place on what is now the Pacific island of Butaritari in 1942. In a bid to destroy Japanese installations, gain intelligence, and take prisoners, the United States Marine Corps raiders attacked Imperial forces on the island. While the Americans managed to kill over half the Japanese soldiers at Mackan Island, the raid failed in its objectives to gain intelligence and take prisoners. The wrecked H-8K stayed intact until 1980, when it collapsed into the lagoon, where it remains today. Number 8. Operation Sunrise. Between February and May 1945, German officials met with representatives of the Western Allies in a series of secret negotiations codenamed Operation Sunrise. Most of the meetings took place in neutral Switzerland, where they discussed the prospect of a local surrender of Nazi forces in northern Italy. Waffen-SS General Karl Wolff and American Office of Strategic Services OSS agent Alan Dulles were the lead negotiators. At the end of the main meeting, Wolff and a fellow Nazi general were given a surrender document to review that the Allies had drafted. The Germans agreed to the terms of the document and signed it at the next meeting. On the surface, Operation Sunrise was a success. After all, it secured a Nazi surrender in Italy, but it led to major future problems in a vastly different sense. The Allies had informed the Soviet Union of the talks but banned its representatives from attending, leading to suspicion among the Russians that the US had ulterior motives and hoped to gain a separate peace agreement with the Germans. Consequently, tensions increased between the Soviet Union and the other Allies. A heated correspondence between Joseph Stalin and Franklin D. Roosevelt ensued, marking one of the first episodes of what would soon become the Cold War. Number 7. The Sparrow Force. Consisting of Australian, Dutch, and British soldiers, the Sparrow Force was formed to protect the island of Timor, which sits among Indonesia's islands. At the time, Portugal, which took a neutral position in the war, controlled West Timor, while the Dutch controlled the east. The Sparrow Force started arriving in December 1941 and was 1,800 strong by the time everyone was there. Early the following year, it fought against the Japanese invasion against both the Portuguese and Dutch-controlled parts of the island in what became known as the Battle of Timor. The main element of the detachment soon surrendered, but other parts of the force continued to wage a guerrilla warfare campaign with the help of the local population. They managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese, but their victories were short-lived and came at a cost. In August of 1942, the Japanese launched a successful counteroffensive. A few months later, they upped the ante by garnering support from the Portuguese and the Timorese people. Between December of that year and January 1943, the remainder of the Sparrow Force withdrew from Timor. Some members of the detachment were taken prisoner between 1942 and 1945 and sent to Japanese-run forced labor camps throughout Southeast Asia, where many died. Number 6. Britain's secret peace mission. The idea of negotiating a peace agreement with Nazi Germany became increasingly attractive to the British during the spring of 1941, as the United Kingdom emerged from a long winter of nightly Luftwaffe bombing raids. At the time, the US was still maintaining an isolationist policy and offered only limited support to the segregated nation. Just months earlier, leading Nazi Party member Rudolf Hess had sent a letter to the Duke of Hamilton requesting to meet on the outskirts of Europe. But the letter was intercepted by British intelligence, and the subsequent Luftwaffe bombing campaign also failed to bring the British to the negotiating table, despite leaving the country in a severely weakened and vulnerable position. Historical records on the matter are scarce, but when the British finally began to consider peace talks, it's believed that they commissioned a well-connected Finnish immigrant named Karl Tancred Borenius as their spokesperson. Some researchers claim that the UK's Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, sent Borenius to Geneva, Switzerland to deliver the message to the Germans that he was willing to discuss peace, but not for much longer. There are numerous unanswered questions about why the British chose Borenius, an aging art historian with no formal experience working in government, for such a delicate negotiation, but they believed he had the diplomatic skills to perform the task. And it's still unclear to this day who accompanied Borenius to Switzerland and exactly what the conversations entailed. Regardless of what went on, the war continued and any hopes of an Anglo-German settlement were ultimately abandoned. Number 5. Operation Unthinkable. In May of 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the development of 2 different possible future war plans against the Soviet Union, both of which were codenamed Operation Unthinkable. The first plan proposed waging a surprise attack on Red Army forces in Germany to impose the will of the Western Allies on the Soviets. But British military officials knew that without help from the Americans, the plot was sure to fail. With Plan A off the table, the planning committee moved on to formulating a new Operation Unthinkable. The new plan raised the possibility of launching a defensive attack against the Soviets amid a predicted advance toward the North Sea after the US had withdrawn its troops from Europe. But when Britain's Labour Party came to power in 1945, it was put on the back burner and was ultimately forgotten about entirely. Neither plan was ever revealed to the Americans or any of the other allies for that matter. Although it never actually happened, Operation Unthinkable represented one of the first Cold War contingency plans for potential warfare against the Soviet Union. And in this sense, it serves as proof that the Cold War tensions had already started to brew before the end of World War II. What do you think would have happened if Operation Unthinkable had been carried out? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. Deepa Raid. On August 19, 1942, 5,000 Canadian troops and 1,000 British troops launched an amphibious attack on the French port of Deepa on the English Channel coast. Their goal was to capture Nazi-occupied territory in Europe, but it failed miserably. The Germans were well prepared for the Allied arrival, and an onslaught ensued. Over the next 10 hours, at least 1,000 Allied soldiers were killed and more than 2,000 were taken prisoner, and 106 Allied aircraft were destroyed. If things had gone as planned, the Allies would have captured the port and destroyed German coastal defenses and important structures. But it was a complete disaster from the very beginning. Ground forces were trapped at the beach and blocked from entering the Nazi-occupied town, partially because they lacked sufficient air and naval support, and also because the Germans were prepared for their arrival. When it became clear that they had no chance of winning the battle, the Allies retreated. The failed mission taught both sides important lessons about coastal warfare and influenced the planning and success of the D-Day invasion into Normandy nearly 2 years later. Following the Deepa Raid, also known as Operation Jubilee, the Allies realized the importance of using artificial harbors and modifying tanks specifically for use on beaches. They also implemented a new tactical air force which helped to strengthen ground troops in future battles. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Chief of Combined Operations Louis Mountbatten both claimed that the lessons gleaned from the Deepa failure outweighed the costs. In the meantime, the Germans focused on improving the defense of their occupied coastlines throughout Europe. Number 3. Operation Market Garden. In late September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden in hopes of freeing the Netherlands from Nazi control and creating an invasion route into northern Germany. Paratroopers from 3 Allied airborne divisions landed on key bridges and liberated several parts of the country, but the mission failed to meet several of its objectives, and for various reasons. One shortcoming came with the complicated capture of the Rhine River's northernmost bridge at Arnhem. Fearing a strong German anti-aircraft presence at the bridge itself, the Allies dropped 10,000 Polish and American troops nicknamed the Red Devils up to 8 miles from the site. But what felt like a safe distance proved to be too far away. Only 1 battalion managed to reach the bridge, while all the other troops were pushed back by the Germans. Moreover, a lack of transport aircraft meant that British forces had to be dropped into Arnhem over a 3-day period, decreasing the chances of waging a surprise attack against the Germans. In addition to these delays, bad weather interfered with the transport of both troops and supplies. Radio communications failed in the densely wooded landscape, and the narrow road toward Arnhem slowed the Allied advance greatly. By the end of the mission's first day, they had traveled just 7 miles. Their slow advance gave the Germans time to situate a strong defense at Arnhem and elsewhere, and some Allied units suffered heavy casualties. The lone British battalion that reached Arnhem began evacuating after 5 days of fiercely resisting the Nazis, when it became clear that Operation Market Garden had failed. Number 2. Operation Barbarosa. In a mission codenamed Operation Barbarosa, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in hopes of conquering the country before Russia's notoriously harsh winter conditions set in. Hitler was confident that his forces would secure a quick victory, and at first it did seem very likely. 3 million German and Axis troops came face to face with the massive but woefully underprepared Red Army. Joseph Stalin had ignored warnings about an impending invasion, and his forces were poorly trained. On the first day alone, over 1,000 Soviet aircraft were shot down, and in the coming days, the intruders took millions of Red Army soldiers prisoners. Trailing behind the German army were SS death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen, who slaughtered massive numbers of civilians. The Red Army fiercely resisted despite its many losses. Slowly but surely, their counterattacks took a detrimental toll on the Nazis and slowed their advance toward Moscow. As his forces became weakened, Hitler ordered them to focus on seizing other cities, inadvertently giving the Soviets time to plan for Moscow's defense. When they were finally on their way to Moscow, the Germans got stuck on muddy, unpaved roads. Then they encountered the Red Army, which by then had become strengthened and launched a counterattack, forcing the Nazis to retreat. Over 1 million German and Axis soldiers died during Operation Barbarossa, which proved to be a colossal failure. Hitler blamed the winter weather, but experts claimed that the Nazis failed to plan properly and underestimated the Red Army's strength. Number 1. Operation Shingle. In Italy in January 1944, the Battle of Anzio began with an amphibious Allied invasion known as Operation Shingle. The plan was for American and British forces to land at Anzio and Nettuno, outflank German troops along their main defensive line, and attack Rome. While the Nazis were initially caught off guard, the initiative failed when Major General John Lucas failed to keep up with the element of surprise and delayed his advance, which proved to be catastrophic. Lucas's hesitation gave the Germans time to build up a defense and flood the marshland that the Allies had just reclaimed. Their plan was to destroy the enemy by making the conditions ripe for the spread of disease. Shells rained over the beach, marsh, harbor, and other parts of the region for weeks, and the fighting continued for months. Lucas was relieved of his duty and sent home about a month into the battle, at which point it had become clear that his overly cautious tendencies had hindered the Allies' chances of success. While it's impossible to know whether they might have won under a different commander, some modern experts believe that a more daring and quick-acting general may have waged a bolder and more aggressive invasion, and that this would have greatly increased the chances of success. By depriving the Germans an opportunity to prepare, it's possible and perhaps very likely that the Allies would have had a much easier time gaining an upper hand. Both the Allies and the Nazis suffered heavy casualties in the Anzio campaign, with an estimated 37,000 non-combat related. In its analysis of the devastating battle, the U.S. Center of Military History stated that the allotment of troops and supplies were inadequate for accomplishing the high goals that the operation had set out to achieve.
9. Air Aruba P4 YSA. Recently, the Society for Gentlemen Explorers discovered ruins of a wrecked plane tucked away in the foothills of the Southern Highlands, near the Jabtiel Salt Flats. It's an Air Aruba P4 YSA aircraft, and it appears as though it was seemingly forgotten in the tropical undergrowth. It's located roughly half an hour away from the beautiful historic city of Willemstad in Curacao. When explorers climbed inside, they could still see the stewardess call buttons and old reading lights, and on the overhead panels. Oxygen masks are strewn all over the cabin floor. The cockpit windows are shattered and gone, and jungle flowers grow through the altimeters, fuel pump gauges, air pressure dials, and empty pilot seats. It's almost as though the plane crashed into the Caribbean jungle decades ago, and all the passengers simply disappeared. The plane was purchased and operated by Air Aruba, a tiny commercial airline that operated short trips around the Caribbean until it filed for bankruptcy in 2000. At one point, it was planned to be used as a restaurant after it was stripped of its wings and propellers. The customers would be seated inside the plane, while the workers were in an adjoining adobe. However, the plan was never developed. It was never revealed who owned the plane due to a lack of documentation, or how it even ended up in Curacao. These aircraft were designed by Japan's Nihon Aircraft Manufacturing Company and were built between 1962 and 1974. They could transport 60 people and resembled the versatile American Douglas DC-3. However, the history of the aircraft is bizarre. Among the 182 originally produced, over 20 hull-loss accidents occurred, resulting in over 260 deaths. In 1969, a Korean air flight was hijacked over North Korean airspace. The plane, crew, and passengers are allegedly still being held captive on North Korean soil. In 1976, an Olympic Airways plane crashed into the side of a mountain near Kozani, Greece. The plane's history is littered with forced landings, runway overruns, and being abandoned at sea. 8. PB5A Catalina. On April 5, 1942, Ensign William H. Howe took off from Mission Squadron 11, VP-11 on a lengthy patrol with a crew. While descending in terrible weather with rainstorms, low overcast, and limited visibility, the plane crashed near Makapu Point on Oahu. Everyone on board was killed on impact. Today, wreckage from the crash site remains on a cliff near Makapu Lighthouse. The front landing gear log and some of the debris still have blue and grey paint on them. A memorial plaque honoring the crew may be seen at the Makapu State Shore Side Park Overlook, near the Makapu Lighthouse in Waimanalo, Oahu. The Hawaii Aviation Preservation Society commissioned the memorial, which reads, "Not far from here, on April 5, 1942, 9 American naval aviators perished in service of their country. They crashed their Consolidate Catalina PB5A serial bureau number 2487 seaplane, returning from 12.5 hours of patrolling the water around Hawaii for enemy forces. They crashed trying to land in foul weather and darkness, mistaking the Makapu Light for Barber's Point Light, and hitting the hillside during a low-altitude circling maneuver. You are not forgotten. Placed by the Hawaii Museum of Flying. 7. The Vought F4U Corsair. The Vought F4U Corsair was a Navy and Marine Corps military plane with bent wings and made a distinct sound. It was around 33 feet, 10 meters long, and 16 feet, 4.8 meters tall. It was deployed to Ohio and assigned to the USMC, MAW-1, and MAG-12. During World War II in 1945, Lieutenant W.H. Holden flew the plane from Molokai Airfield on Oahu to Awa Field on a training trip one day. The Corsair began to splutter after only 20 minutes in the air, which was attributed to a fuel deficiency. Fortunately for the pilot, he was able to gently land the plane on the water before the engine died. Unfortunately, it didn't last long above water and soon began to sink. Luckily, Lieutenant Holden was wearing a life jacket that saved his life. He left the accident with a mere cut over his right eye and a story to tell. The ruins of the Vought F4U Corsair now serve as an artificial reef and have created a great habitat for a variety of fish, turtles, and eels. The Corsair plane disaster gained prominence in the mid-1980s when it was included in an episode of the US television show Magnum. Since then, the wreck has been used by researchers, adventurers, and diving experts to photograph, explore, and study the impacts of the water in the process of recovering a synthetic structure. The wreck lies at about 115 feet, 35 meters, in an area known for unpredictably strong and swift currents. To dive at the site is challenging and considered advanced. Boats and a professional guide are required. 6. B24 Boulders. Located in a desolate area on the slope of Humphreys Peak in Arizona, is a B-24 crash site that's been strangely kept and unspoiled due to its inaccessibility. The disaster occurred in 1944. The aircraft, a training variant of the strategic bombers used in conflict, took off from a California airfield on a normal night flight to New Mexico. There was no moon that night, and the cloud cover was low, so the plane deviated by about 15 miles, 24 kilometers off course. The aircraft was at an altitude of over 11,000 feet, 3,353 meters, when it crashed into Humphreys Peak on the west side around 3:30 a.m. The accident tragically killed all 8 passengers on board. The plane was left as it was after the investigation, leaving an important piece of history behind for future generations of hikers. Engine bits and shattered metal are strewn over the stones. Visitors can see the remains of an airplane wing in the distance. One of the reasons why the wreckage was not removed is because of how hard it is to get to. The area is for experienced hikers only. The terrain includes switchbacks and rock fields, as well as shuffling up the mountain in unmarked territory. Once you see the plane's propeller, you'll know that it's a sign that you aren't that far away from the clearing. You'll also be able to see a plaque that was left right on the wreckage in 1994 by the American Armenian Airmen's Association as a memorial to the crew members of the plane. Would you be up for the challenge of hiking Humphreys Peak to see this crash site? Let us know in the comments, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Wreckage of RAF Bomber. In southern France, deep in a valley of the Alpes de Haute-Provence, is a plain wooden sign that reads L'Avion. The sign is pointing towards an old dirt track that looks like it hasn't been used in years, leading deeper into the valley for over 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers. If you go down the path, you'll see more signs also marked The Plane, until you eventually get to a peculiar pile of rusted metal. After the war, a local artisan salvaged pieces of the plane's wreckage and fashioned the unique metal structure. A modest inscription that reads, "On May 10, 1944, a British Wellington bomber of the Royal Air Force crashed here. The crew's 5 members were all burned to death." The memorial site recalls a tragic occurrence in the fight against savagery and Nazism. A squadron of 20 Wellington bombers left for Foggia, Italy in the early hours of May 10, 1944 to target a weapons facility at Port-les-Valence, a town some 130 miles, 209 kilometers north of Marseille. The Germans were making the dreaded V1 flying bombs and wreaking havoc on London. During the raid, anti-aircraft fire severely damaged the bomber LP-180. The pilot, Flying Officer John Hugler, was just 29 years old and badly needed to land. On the same evening, a tiny, extremely covert cell of the French resistance was preparing for a parachute drop of weapons and supplies from England, roughly 100 miles, 161 kilometers to the south. This specific squad operated under the codename Slaughterman out of the little village of Simian-la-Rotonde. Captain Alexander, the group's leader, kept a close eye on everything. He was actually René Char, a notable poet. Char joined the French resistance in 1940 and was in charge of Charles de Gaulle's section for parachutes and landings in Provence. While Hugler's Wellington was flying to Valence on May 10th, René Char's network in Simian-la-Rotonde gathered around a radio and heard a supposedly anonymous message broadcast by the BBC in London. The bizarre message stated that the shooting star will return, which was followed by the even more cryptic "Arnold sells goats." The code, which was incomprehensible to the Abwehr, warned the resistance organization that there would be a drop of essential weapons and supplies that night. The Slaughtermans had already established a well-used drop zone in the hills overlooking the little village of Chavon, down in the valley from Simian. 7 members of the cell arrived at the drop zone at midnight. They lit lamps to notify the Royal Air Force of the landing zone and waited for the parachute drop while keeping an eye out for German forces. At 2 a.m., the drop was ready to be made. Already struck and looking for somewhere to land, the LP-180 crew saw lights, hoping they were for a landing strip. Hugler attempted to land the plane, but instead hit the trees at full speed. A resistance member witnessing it described it as a very loud roar that shook the earth, then silence, which was followed by gigantic flames. The group attempted to save the Wellington, but the heat and flames were too intense. The next morning, they found the remains of those on board burnt beyond recognition in the cockpit, their ID badges destroyed. René Char had arrived at the crash site at this point. With the big explosion almost certainly spotted by the Germans, the bodies were removed from the plane, Howells ramped in a parachute, and buried a few feet away in the woods. To keep the Germans from discovering the Slaughterman's group job location, larger components of the destroyed plane were hidden away in the woods. Following the liberation of Provence, the Royal Air Force relocated the bodies to a military cemetery in Mazaguez, near Marseille, where they still reside today. 4. Douglas DC3 Iceland. If you stroll down the beach of Iceland's Solheimasunder beach, you'll see a decrepit World War II Douglas D3 military jet rusting away in the volcanic black sand. It crashed at the location in 1973 for reasons that are still unknown today. Investigators thought that the disaster was caused by an empty gasoline tank, and that the pilot attempted to reach the fuel tank before the crew realized they had no alternative but to make an emergency landing. The wreck was abandoned and now stands as a chilling reminder of its former grandeur. A large piece of the fuselage is missing, as are the wings, and just half of the tail remains. Despite the considerable damage, the airplane is in surprisingly decent condition, especially given the fact that it spent over 50 years on the shore in harsh conditions. According to local tradition, a farmer once removed and sold the tail's missing piece. The story, however, has never been confirmed. 3. B-17E crash in Papua New Guinea. A B-17E aircraft crashed in 1942 during one of the US Army Air Force's initial air attacks of the war. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the bomber was on its way to strike ships in Japanese-occupied New Britain when it was intercepted by Japanese fighters. The plane was struck many times and ultimately crash-landed in Papua New Guinea, not because of the damage, but because it ran out of fuel. The 9 airmen on board the aircraft lived, but they battled sickness and terrible heat for 6 weeks alone on the island. They were eventually rescued, but their jet was never located and stayed where it crashed for years. When Australian forces observed the wreckage from their chopper in the early 1970s, they knew it was the missing bomber. When the military arrived to investigate, they discovered the plane was practically undamaged and in astonishingly good shape. The bomber's weapons were still operational and loaded with ammo. There was a canteen with coffee inside the cockpit and even an ashtray still containing cigarette butts. It was recovered in 2006 and hauled to Ley Port, where it waited for clearance to be relocated to the US. The wreck was certified for shipment into the United States in February 2010. It was returned to Hawaii and displayed at the Pacific Aviation Museum at Pearl Harbor, where it arrived on April 10, 2013. 2. Japanese plane wreck, Palau. A surprisingly undamaged Japanese Aichi E-13A World War II aircraft has been discovered by kayakers at the bottom of the sea near the state of Coral in the Republic of Palau. In 1944, the US Army shot down the aircraft, sending it to its watery grave. Images of the jet sitting quietly in its aquatic burial emerged on social media many years ago, generating debate on how difficult it is to imagine that a country as tranquil as Palau was once a war zone. From 1941 until 1945, the IGE-13A was a reconnaissance aircraft. It could hold up to 550 pounds, 250 kilograms of bombs, and could transport 3 crew members. Despite the fact that over 1,400 seaplanes were built during the war, no airworthy ones are known to exist anymore. The aircraft is now home to moss, coral, and other aquatic life. It's a popular tourist destination that may be visited with adequate scuba diving gear. 1. Boeing 747 Jumbo Jet. The Boeing 747 was the first jumbo jet in the world. Boeing intended to reduce airport congestion and make flying less expensive in the 1960s. The only way to accomplish this was to construct an airplane with far more carrying capacity than anything available at the time. For more than 30 years, the 747 was the world's biggest passenger aircraft, measuring 231 feet, 70 meters long, with a wingspan of 195 feet, 59 meters. The dual airplane is still remembered for its vast size and the unique hump that houses its upper deck. The 747 is losing popularity as a commercial aircraft, but Bahrain has found a unique new purpose for the massive plane. In 2019, the government sank a 747 into the Persian Gulf to create Dive Bahrain, a diving destination and artificial reef. It's the largest underwater theme park in the world. According to Tourism Minister Zayed bin Rashid Al Zayani, the decommissioned jet serves as the park's showpiece and is the largest airplane ever submerged. He informed the audience that the location is environmentally healthy and fosters marine growth, despite the fact that many of the world's natural reefs are dying. Several experts cautioned that the plane may corrode and lose structural integrity, potentially endangering aquatic life and the safety of divers. However, the developers proceeded with their preparations, and the location is now available to train divers. Thanks for watching. Which one of these crashed airplane sites would you like to visit? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.